October 24th, 2025, 12:47 p.m. Windsor, Ontario, Canada. I was eating lunch at my desk when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Stellantis Supply, Windsor. My stomach immediately tightened and churned. Calls from the Stellantis Supply Department during lunchtime never brought good news. Robert? This is Jennifer from Stellantis Supply Chain Management. Do you have a few minutes? Of course, I said, setting down my sandwich. What's going on? I am calling to inform you that Stellantis will terminate your supply contract as of November 30th. As we restructure our production, we are considering consolidating our parts supply with U.S.-based suppliers. You will receive official written notification by the end of the business day today. The room seemed to tilt. Wait, what? We have a 3-year contract that runs through 2027. We supply 17 different components for the Windsor assembly plant. What do you mean, discontinuing? The contract includes provisions for production changes. With our shift of operations to U.S. facilities, we're required to source components domestically to comply with new trade requirements and tariff structures. I'm sorry, Robert. It's not personal. It's policy. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Stellantis, my largest client, accounting for 62% of my company's revenue, had just canceled our contract with 5 weeks' notice. My name is Robert Desjardins. I'm 49 years old, and for the past 19 years, I've owned and operated Desjardins Automotive Components in Windsor, Ontario. We're a Tier 2 auto parts supplier. We manufacture specialty fasteners, brackets, and metal components for automotive assembly. We employed 23 people. Last year, we did 4.2 million Canadian dollars in revenue, mostly supplying the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant and GM's operations in Oshawa. Or we did. Until Trump's protectionist policies convinced Stellantis and GM to shift production back to the United States, and Canadian suppliers like me became collateral damage. Let me explain how we got here. The auto industry in Canada has always been intertwined with the U.S. market. For decades, there was fluid trade across the border. Parts made in Canada went to U.S. assembly plants, and vice versa. It worked because both countries benefited. Canadian workers had good-paying manufacturing jobs. American automakers had access to skilled labor and quality components at competitive prices. Then, Trump came back into power with his America First agenda cranked up to maximum. New tariffs on Canadian auto parts. Tax incentives for automakers who brought production back to U.S. soil. Threats of additional trade barriers if companies didn't comply. Stellantis and GM did the math. It was cheaper to consolidate production in the U.S. than to keep fighting Trump's tariffs and facing his threats. So they announced they were moving significant operations out of Canada. Stellantis from Windsor and Brampton, GM from Oshawa. The Canadian government tried to fight back. Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced retaliatory measures on October 24th, cutting tariff-free import quotas for Stellantis by 50% and GM by 24.2%. He accused the automakers of breaking their legal obligations to Canada and Canadian workers. He even threatened to demand repayment of the public funds they'd received, over 100 million Canadian dollars that Stellantis alone had taken to convert their facilities to electric vehicle production. But it was too late. The damage was done. Stellantis and GM had already made their decisions, and suppliers like me were being cut loose. After Jennifer's call, I immediately pulled up our financial records. The numbers were devastating. Desjardins Automotive Components. Revenue breakdown. Stellantis Windsor, $2.6 million, 62% of total revenue. GM, Oshawa, $980,000, 23% of total revenue. Other clients, smaller manufacturers, $620,000, 15% of total revenue. Total, $4.2 million annually. Losing Stellantis meant losing 62% of our business overnight. But it was actually worse than that, because with Stellantis moving production to the US, GM would likely follow with their own supplier changes. I'd probably lose both contracts within months. That meant losing 85% of my revenue base. With $620,000 in remaining business and $380,000 in annual overhead, payroll, rent, equipment, insurance. The math was simple. I'd be losing $160,000 per year, assuming I could even keep operating at such a reduced scale. I called my wife Marie first. We'd built this business together. She handled finances and administration while I managed production and client relationships. 19 years of our lives poured into Desjardins Automotive. Marie, Stellantis just canceled our contract, effective November 30th. Silence on the other end. Then, can they do that? Apparently, they can. Production changes clause in the contract. They're moving operations to the US, so they're sourcing from US suppliers. What about GM? I'm guessing we'll get a similar call within days. If Stellantis is moving production and switching suppliers, GM will do the same. They always follow each other's lead. Robert, what are we going to do? I didn't have an answer. I was 49 years old with a business that was about to lose 85% of its revenue. I had 23 employees who depended on their paychecks. I had a $180,000 business loan with 4 years of payments remaining. I had equipment leases, facility costs, supplier contracts. And I had 5 weeks to figure out what to do before the Stellantis revenue stopped flowing. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting with my production manager, Paul, and my sales lead, Caroline. Paul had been with me for 16 years. He'd helped build this company from 3 employees to 23. Caroline had developed most of our client relationships over the past decade. Stellantis canceled our contract, I said without preamble. Effective end of November. That's 62% of our revenue. Paul's face went pale. Can they just do that? They did. And I'm expecting GM to follow within days. Caroline was already pulling up her client database. What about expanding with our existing smaller clients? Can we make up the volume? Not quickly enough, I said. Our small clients combined do $620,000 annually. Stellantis alone was $2.6 million. There's no way to replace that kind of volume in weeks or even months. New clients? Paul suggested. There must be other manufacturers who need parts. Every auto supplier in Ontario is in the same situation, I said. Stellantis and GM pulling out affects hundreds of suppliers. We'll all be competing for scraps from whoever's left. The reality was sinking in. We weren't going to find a magic solution. We were watching our business die in slow motion, and there wasn't anything we could do to stop it. What about the employees? Paul asked quietly. That was the question I'd been dreading. 23 people worked for Desjardins Automotive. Most had been with me for 5, 10, even 15 years. They were skilled workers, machinists, welders, quality control specialists, good people with families and mortgages, and lives built around the stability of auto sector jobs. I don't know yet, I said. Let me talk to our accountant and lawyer. But realistically, we're probably looking at significant layoffs. 3 days later, October 27th, I got the call I'd been expecting. GM procurement. Same message as Stellantis. Contract termination, effective December 15th, consolidating suppliers to US-based providers. That was it. Both major clients gone. $3.58 million in annual revenue, 85% of our business, evaporating within 6 weeks. I met with our accountant that afternoon. The projections were brutal. Scenario: operations with only small clients. Remaining revenue: $620,000 annually, $51,667 per month. Fixed overhead: $380,000 annually, $31,667 per month. Gross profit, $240,000 before variable costs. Net profit after all costs, approximately $60,000 to $80,000 annually. That meant I could keep operating as a much smaller business, maybe 6 to 8 employees instead of 23, and make barely enough to survive. No growth, no investment in new equipment, no financial security, just scraping by, hoping nothing went wrong. Or I could close the business, lay everyone off, liquidate assets, and try to pay off debts and start over at 50. Neither option was good. On October 30th, I gathered all 23 employees in our production floor. They knew something was wrong. Rumors had been spreading since the Stellantis news broke publicly. "I need to be honest with you about where we are," I began. "Stellantis canceled our contract on October 24th. GM canceled 3 days later. Together, those two clients represented 85% of our revenue. Without them, Desjardins Automotive cannot sustain current operations." I saw tears, anger, shock, resignation, every emotion playing across their faces simultaneously. "I have to make layoffs. Effective November 15th, 15 positions are being eliminated. I'm keeping 8 employees to handle our remaining client base." Dennis, one of our senior machinists, who'd been with me for 14 years, stood up. "This is because of Trump, isn't it? His tariffs and his America First bullshit. Stellantis and GM are moving to the U.S. because Trump made it expensive to stay here." "Yes," I said simply. "Trump's protectionist policies made it more expensive for them to operate in Canada, so they moved production back to the U.S., and Canadian suppliers like us are being cut out." "What about the Canadian government?" someone asked. "I read that Champagne is fighting back with import restrictions." He is. Canada cut Stellantis' tariff-free import quota by 50% and GM's by 24.2%. It's retaliation for them breaking their commitments. But it's too late to save our contracts. The decisions have already been made. Marie, our quality control supervisor who'd been with us for 11 years, spoke up. "So we're losing our jobs because 2 countries are having a trade war, and we're the casualties?" "Yes, that's exactly what's happening." The meeting fell apart after that. Some people left immediately. Others stayed to ask questions I couldn't answer. A few just sat in shocked silence. Dennis approached me after everyone else had left. "Rob, I'm 53 years old. I've worked in auto parts my whole adult life. What am I supposed to do now? Who's going to hire a 53-year-old machinist when the entire sector is collapsing?" I didn't have an answer. Dennis was right. The entire Ontario auto supplier network was collapsing simultaneously as Stellantis and GM moved operations south. Hundreds, maybe thousands of workers like Dennis were being thrown into a job market that couldn't absorb them. "I'll write you the best reference letter I can," I said weakly. "And if you find something, I'll talk to whoever needs to hear from me." "A reference letter," he repeated bitterly. "That and $3 might buy me a coffee." Over the next 2 weeks, I watched my business, my life's work, unravel. The 15 laid-off employees cleared out their workstations. Our production schedule became nearly empty as Stellantis and GM orders wound down. Our warehouse, once packed with components ready to ship, became increasingly bare. The 8 employees I kept were the minimum crew needed to serve our remaining small clients. Paul stayed on as production manager. Caroline stayed to manage the drastically reduced client base. 6 production workers to handle the reduced volume. Everyone who stayed looked haunted. Survivor's guilt mixed with fear that their jobs might be next. On November 10th, I received a letter from Stellantis' legal department. They wanted to reclaim some of the specialized tooling they'd helped fund over the years, dies, molds, and fixtures designed specifically for their components. Total value, approximately $240,000. "They're taking the tooling," Marie said, reading the letter over my shoulder. We helped pay for that. We invested in those tools. They technically own them according to our contract, I said. They funded the initial purchase, even though we've been maintaining and upgrading them for years. So they're taking away the tools and the business. What are we supposed to do with machining equipment designed for parts we're no longer making? She was right. The specialized equipment we'd invested in over 19 years was mostly useless without the Stellantis and GM contracts. We had CNC machines calibrated for specific components, welding stations set up for particular assemblies, quality control equipment designed for their specifications. All of it becoming increasingly worthless as our client base evaporated. By mid-November, I was having serious conversations with our attorney about bankruptcy options. Even with the 8 remaining employees and reduced overhead, we were barely breaking even. We had the $180,000 business loan to repay, equipment leases, and remaining supplier obligations. You could try to keep operating, our attorney said, but you're 1 bad month away from insolvency. If any of your remaining clients reduce orders, or if you have any unexpected costs, you're done. What about selling the business? To whom? Who wants to buy an auto parts supplier in Ontario right now? Stellantis and GM are moving production to the U.S. Every supplier in the region is in crisis. There are no buyers. I sat in my office on November 20th, looking at photos on the wall from better times. Desjardins Automotive's grand opening in 2006. Our first major Stellantis contract in 2008. The expansion to our current facility in 2014. Employee appreciation events, safety milestones, production records. 19 years of building something I was proud of. A business that employed people, served clients well, contributed to the community. And it was dying not because we'd failed, not because we'd done anything wrong, but because Donald Trump decided that American companies should bring production back to the U.S., and Canadian workers and businesses were acceptable casualties. The most frustrating part was the injustice of it. Stellantis had taken over $100 million in Canadian public funds to convert facilities to electric vehicle production. They'd made commitments to Canada and Canadian workers. And then, when Trump made it financially attractive to move to the U.S., they just left, took the money, broke their promises, and moved south. And the Canadian government's response, cutting import quotas and threatening to demand repayment, was too little, too late. The damage was done. Stellantis and GM were already gone, and their Canadian suppliers were already dying. On November 28th, I made the decision I'd been avoiding. I called the 8 remaining employees together. I've been trying to find a way to keep the business operating, I said. But the math doesn't work. We're losing money every month. I'm going to file for bankruptcy after the holidays. That means all 8 of you will be laid off by mid-January. No one seemed surprised. They'd all seen the writing on the wall. What about severance? Paul asked. 2 weeks for every year of service, up to a maximum we can afford. It's not much. It's not enough. But it's all we have left. As I write this in late November 2025, Desjardins Automotive Components is in its death throes. We'll limp through December, fulfilling our last few orders. In January, I'll file bankruptcy, lay off the final 8 employees, and liquidate whatever assets have any value. 19 years of work, gone. 23 jobs, eliminated. A business that did nothing wrong except rely on clients who were convinced by Trump's policies to move production back to the United States. Stellantis and GM will be fine. They'll keep making cars and trucks, just in American factories instead of Canadian ones. Trump will claim victory for bringing jobs back to America, conveniently ignoring the jobs he destroyed in Canada. And Robert Desjardins from Windsor, Ontario, the 49-year-old who spent 19 years building an auto parts business? He's starting over with nothing, trying to figure out what comes next, when the industry he built his life around has been gutted by protectionist policies that treat Canadian workers as expendable. That's the real cost of Trump's America First agenda. Not just lost trade, lost businesses, lost livelihoods, lost futures for people who did everything right, but happened to be on the wrong side of a border when political winds shifted. Dennis was right that day after the layoff announcement. We're casualties in a trade war. And unlike the politicians and corporate executives making these decisions, we're the ones who actually pay the price.